Recording, and we're about to go live on Facebook because that's where all y'all aunties and uncles is, and we want them to see this too. So once that gets started, we are going to get started. Thank y'all, everybody, so much again for coming in. I see a bunch of familiar faces and names. I see a bunch of names of people that I don't know. This is very exciting. All right, so I'm Salifu. I am a member of the Lowcountry Action Committee, also a member of the Black Alliance for Peace and the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And I'm joined by some of my comrades in LAC. I'll let everybody introduce yourselves real quick.
I'm Erica, LAC.
What's up, y'all? I'm Joshua, LAC, member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization, as well as the National Network on Cuba.
Hey everyone, I'm Shaquille, also a co-founder of the Lowcountry Action Committee. We're members of the National Network on Cuba and the National Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression. Awesome. I think that's all the intros. That might be our cue to get started. Y'all ready to go? So first of all, everyone, welcome to the first instance in our learning series. And we'll talk more about the purpose of the series and who was inspired by later. But first, Salifu, can you just speak really quickly to how all of our orgs came together to put this program together?
Yes. All right. So the James Campbell Learning Circle is hosted by 5 different organizations. We are all Black-led organizations in the South. And we are all coming together sort of on the basis of valuing political education, valuing, Black people in the South, because, they be trying to come for us and make it seem like we don't know nothing and we just, ignorant. And we know that's not true. We know that the Black radical tradition really comes straight out of the South. But the organizations that make up the James Campbell Learning Circle are the Southern chapter of the Black Alliance for Peace, Greensboro People's Freedom Assembly in North Carolina, Mapinduzi in North Carolina, Community Movement Builders in Atlanta, and Lowcountry Action Committee in Charleston. So that's the James Campbell Learning Circle, and we all really excited to have y'all here. Today is LAC's turn, but if y'all come for the following events, y'all will see new faces, new voices, new perspectives.
All right, perfect way to start us off. So as Salifu mentioned, we are the Lowcountry Action Committee. So we're going to give you some quick background on our org before we jump into our session tonight. And we are a Black-led grassroots organization dedicated to Black liberation through service, political education, and collective action in the Lowcountry. And as I mentioned before, we're members of the National Network on Cuba, the National Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression, and we're also founding members of Charleston's People's Budget Coalition. Here are a list of some of our demands. We have many more, but they all have to do with self-determination and freedom for Black people. So whether that's in the form of education and anti-gentrification, economic funding, access to healthy foods and clean water, these are a collective of some of our demands, and they're continuously developing over time and a response to the needs of our community. So one of our major programs was our Food for Thought grocery giveaway, and now we call it the Freedom Bag Drive. So every third Saturday we give freedom bags to our community members, and we're expanding that to various areas in the Lowcountry. Some screenshots you see here are just some examples of the programming that we've done in the past. These include information for community members about gentrification, about heirs property, vaccination clinics, thinking about reimagining public safety and rethinking the concept of policing, and then also helping community members get involved in the land. So volunteering to help do a crop planting, do a community archiving, just various things. And here's an example of some of the propaganda that we give out during our Freedom Bag Drive. So we really want to build community and share resources to make our programs true mutual aid. And now we're going to have co-founder Erica Veal speak a little bit about why we named this learning circle the James Campbell Learning Circle, and just speak generally about Mr. Campbell's life.
Okay, so thanks, Shaquille. Mr. Campbell was one of my mentors here in Charleston. He's a Charleston native. He was born in 1925. He passed away in 2021 in January. And he was active in the community. He was an educator and activist. He was one of the first people to help legitimize Black and African studies and Puerto Rican and Hispanic studies as academic disciplines at the K through 12 and college level. And so most of his educational career was devoted to that. He also worked with Malcolm X, and he co-founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity in 1964, and he was in charge of the educational component. He taught at the Liberation School. He taught a Liberation School class for adults and for youth, and he would bring speakers in. They would speak on Africa, the Arab slave trade, anti-imperialism topics, and he was heavily involved in that type of organizing work. He was a theater major and an English major, so he worked a lot in the off-Broadway movement, which is when he got introduced to classical Marxism. He was a dialectical materialist. He worked in the independence movement in Africa. He went to Tanzania, and he was there for about a decade, teaching English and studying deeply classical Marxism before he came back to the States. And he eventually retired in 91 and came back home to Charleston. And he was really active in organizing efforts here locally. And he used to do a lot of study circles. And like on his 85th birthday, I believe he had a study circle. On his 90th birthday, he had a study circle. And we looked at Jack Odell's Climbing Jacob's Ladder. So we wanted to create some sort of teaching session, some learning circle, political education in his honor. And so that's where the James Campbell Learning Circle came from.
Thank you, Erica. And next we have, what is capitalism? Our presentation is going to begin. So, Salifu, I'm going to cue up this video and hopefully everyone can hear it.
Actually, before you cue it, I think I want to go ahead and go into definition real quick.
Let's do it.
All right. So here's the moment we've all been waiting for. What is capitalism, right? All right. So capitalism, if you look at this graphic right here on the screen and this definition, capitalism is the dominant economic system in the world today, where all the resources on earth are owned and controlled by private corporate interests in order to exploit those resources for private profit. So the private profit there, that part is the part that's like really doing a lot of the heavy work here. So imagine us, there's what, 30 of us in here. Imagine that the 30 of us got dropped off on an abandoned island. And on that island, there's a source of fresh water. There's trees that got fruits in them. It's some chickens running around on there, some hogs. It's plenty of wood and some materials to build houses. And it's 30 of us on the island. There's two ways that the 30 of us could decide to take advantage of all those resources on that island. The first way would be for us to decide, hey, it's 30 of us. We all deserve opportunity to eat, to have access to clean water, to safe shelter. So let's start distributing that based on sort of who needs it the most, right? Somebody might need more food than somebody else. Somebody might require more water than somebody else, but it's fine. We divide it among ourselves. That's the first way. Everybody owns. The second way would be for 10 of y'all who stronger than the rest of us, or 10 of y'all who known each other longer than the rest of us, to get together and be like, I'm gonna hold down the water, and could you give me a hammer? I'm gonna round up all the chickens and I'm gonna hold them over here. And can 3 of y'all come? And if people want to come and try to get chickens, then you bust them upside the head. And what we can do is we can make all the rest of the, how many did I split off from y'all? 10, all the rest of the 20 of them come to us to pay us if they need things, come to us to ask our permission, and we can grant them the right to need things. So as Kwame Ture would say, there's only capitalism, which is what we just talked about there, or socialism, which is everybody owning. So that is how you describe, that's the most basic way I can think of to describe capitalism. But in this video that's about to play, Kwame Ture goes into it in a little bit more detail.
We must understand clearly when we talk about capitalism, who are the capitalists? As if we understand that there are only a few people who own and control the means of production in the society, then we begin to understand that there are a few capitalists. And these capitalists exploit everybody because everybody works for them. Everybody sells their labor to them. It is by selling your labor to a capitalist that he's really able to exploit you. Instead of going through theories, let me give some direct example. Let's say that I'm a capitalist. And let's say that I sell shirts. I sell shirts. I have a shirt factory. Let's say this is my factory. I own it. The machinery. I have a place where I get cotton. Now I own it. I'm the capitalist. And let's say you are my workers. You are my workers. You don't know me. You never see me. You see my lackeys, you know, maybe my foreman, but you never see me. Now, let's say it costs me 50 cents for cotton for every shirt I make. And let's say it costs me 50 cents for upkeep of my machinery. That's $1. And let's suppose I pay you $1 for every shirt you make. That means it costs me $2 to get a shirt. Labor included, your labor. I pay you for making the shirt. Now, when I sell the shirt, being a capitalist, and you must know something about capitalism, very important. The sole motivating force in a capitalist society is profit. Profit. That is the sole motivating force. Profit. Get money. Get it. Get it as fast as you can. Get it any way you can, but get it. Just get it. Just get it. And even in the African community, it affects us here in this country because Africans, those of us living in America, those of us born in America, we are imbued with the philosophy of capitalism, and sometimes we don't even recognize it. Thus, you find brothers and sisters even selling dope to their brothers and sisters to make money. Again, because we're imbued with the philosophy of get some money. Ain't nothing wrong to kill for money. Hell, your country is napalming for money. You can certainly kill for some money. All right, just get it. Just get it. It's the overall philosophy. When we talk about revolution, we must talk about changing values. We must talk about changing values, and we must understand these values. To the shirt factory. I've not forgotten. I'm just going to tie it in. I'll tie it in for you. I'll tie it in. You will see, you must look under the shirt factory, too. You must look for spiraling economy. That's very important, spiraling economy. I sell the shirt for $5. I sell the shirt for $5. I don't do anything. You're the one who make the shirt. I'm exploiting your labor. You toil, you sweat, I get the fruit. That's right, I get it. But you grow it, you plant it by the sweat of your brow. I get it. I sell the shirt for $5. I am exploiting your labor. I really am exploiting your labor. I mean, even when you want a shirt, hey, you got to come to my store and buy the shirt for $5. Hey, I really am exploiting you. Now, you're workers, you're in a factory, so you begin to get social consciousness. Yes, you do. Marx talks about this. Because you're working together, you see the socialized process, the laboring process, and you're able to see clearly how you're being exploited. So you get together, and you start talking about, we want more money. You tell my foreman we want more money. So the foreman comes to see me. He says, the workers say they want more money. Later for them. Keep them working, man. So he comes back, no raise. So y'all work, but y'all get a little bit more agitated, you know, because it's scientific. The pressure rises, and as the pressure rises, the consciousness must rise. It's scientific. It can't be stopped. That's why revolution can't be stopped. Then you say, hey, look here, we're going to strike. So the foreman comes back and said, hey, they say they're going to strike. I say, oh, let them strike, man. And sure enough, y'all strike. Yeah, y'all strike on me. Now, when you strike, of course, my machinery stops. I ain't making no money. So after a while, I called my foreman. I said, what do they want? He says, well, they said they want $1.50 more a shirt. They want 50 cents more a shirt. So I said, okay, let them have it. So I'll bring you back. You happy? I pay you $1.50 more. Right, so it now costs me $2.50 to make a shirt. It cost me $2.50 to make a shirt. Before, it cost me $2. I was selling it for $5. But hey, look here. I can't go out there and keep selling it for $5. Hey, how am I going to do that? I'm going to lose profit. And look here. Since the sole motivating force in a capitalist system is profit, ain't no need for me to come and sell it for $5.50. Hey, no. Next time you see that shirt on the market, it's going to cost you $7.50. Right, right. And that's what's known as the spiraling economy, because profit is what about wages go up into demands of the workers and prices rocket. Wages go up, prices rockets, and it keeps going and going and going until it's got to blow the top. It's scientifically real. That's why Nixon is talking about freezing wages and freezing prices. He's stupid. You got to freeze capitalism, Nixon. Freeze capitalism. That's a problem. That's a problem. Yes, that's a problem. You must understand these concepts, because once you begin to understand them and master them, you will see the inevitability of revolution. Not only the inevitability of revolution, but you will see the inevitability of victory for the struggling masses around the world once you understand the scientific principles of revolution. Once you understand it.
All right.
You must understand clearly when we.
I hope y'all enjoyed that. Yeah, LAC did make the video. We'll drop the link to the video in the chat for y'all. So now we want some feedback from y'all. Who are some of the examples of the capitalists that Kwame Ture is talking about in that video? We'll take a few seconds for y'all just to drop. Like, when you think of capitalists, who's coming to your mind? McDonald's, Walmart, Bezos, Apple, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, Tesla, Goldman Sachs, Elon Musk, Lockheed Martin, Walmart dude, the Walton brothers, yeah, JP Morgan, Hilton, Mark Zuckerberg, yeah, he like a robot, Wells Fargo. Somebody said Trump wish he was a capitalist. Exactly, right? So yeah, those are some great. Jack from Twitter, yes, all those people, those are great examples of capitalists. All billionaires, right? Being a billionaire is immoral. Yes, thank you for that. So yeah, when we talk about capitalists, right, we're talking about people who own the means of production. They have the ability to take money and use that money to generate even more money. In Marxist terms, a lot of these people are considered the bourgeoisie. That's where the word bougie comes from. I know Black people love to be, Black and bougie. What is it? Whatever Migos said. All right, so let me get the next question. So thinking about what Kwame Ture said, and just maybe a little bit based on what y'all think and what y'all feel, what's the relationship between Africans in America and capitalism today? Hopefully, I'm looking for some interesting responses to this. So let's see. We'll take a few seconds to do that as well. Parasitism, exploitation. Slavery was the worst form of wage labor because they didn't need to be paid. Shaquille says victims of capitalism. Darius Nelson says chattel. Josh says Africans are exploited by the capitalists. Michelle says commodities. Douglas says we're the commodities. Kenneth Avery Jr. says the Africans were the capital. Christian says striving for equality via capitalist accumulation. All these are on point. I'm waiting on somebody to say Black people need more capitalism. Celebrities lure Black people into trappings and allure of capitalism. Absolutely. Luis says more Black capitalists than ever, still no power for the masses of our people. Kim Clark says the culture is stolen by white people. And Douglas says, again, our culture is commodified every second of the day. All of y'all are on point, right? Super on point. So one thing that I wanted to add here, right, is that a lot of people, when they think of capitalists, they just automatically think of people with money. And what we want to make clear tonight is that you are not a capitalist just because you got $2,000 in the bank, you got expensive taste, you like to eat at Ruth Chris, or you drive a BMW. Those things are not what make you a capitalist, right? If you sell your labor to somebody else, if you wake up in the morning and you punch a clock, if you wake up in the morning and you got to send your boss an email to tell them why you wasn't online on Slack at 8 a.m. You're a worker, babe. You're a worker, bro. That means that you are in a different class than the capitalists. Your interest and Jeff Bezos' interest are not aligning currently, and they're probably never going to align. They're actually not ever going to align, right? So no matter how much you want to see yourself as a capitalist, you're likely not going to ever be one. So the point here is that you have to be in solidarity with other people who are in your position. Once you understand that you aren't a capitalist, that you are a worker, that's called developing class consciousness. It makes you aware of your place in the world. And the last thing that I want to say on this topic is that there's no way to reform capitalism into something that's kinder or more diverse. There's a lot of people out there that will try to trick you using words like compassionate capitalism or even Black capitalism, right? If we understand what Kwame Ture says in that video, and if we understand some of the definitions that people have thrown into the chat, like Michael was saying, we aren't capitalists, but many of us align with capitalist bourgeois values, right? If we understand this, then we understand that capitalism is a system that always requires for there to be some people on the bottom. It will always make a few exceptions. It's always going to let you get a Tyler Perry off. It's always going to let you get a Jay-Z off. It's always going to let you get an Oprah off. But the vast majority of African people in the US always have to be at the bottom of the system of capitalism. So that is to say, there's no way to solve racism or the thing that people like to call anti-Blackness. These things cannot be solved within the confines of capitalism. And then also, Black people owning businesses is great, but we always have to question how powerful those businesses can be under capitalism, right? We understand capitalism is always about exploitation. That explains why the Black-owned businesses that you know are always struggling so hard. They always struggling. They always starting and failing. Why is that? It's because of capitalism. It's not because of the businesses themselves. It's because of capitalism. So the way I like to explain this is that it's one thing to own a wing restaurant, and yeah, you got your, barbecue, lemon pepper or whatever you sell. People come in, they love it, but it's something completely different to own the land that the chickens roam on. It's something completely different to own a factory where chicken is being processed, right? So all these things to say, we are not capitalists. We are not capitalists. And if you are a capitalist in here right now, hey, how you doing? But yeah, so with that said, I'm gonna turn this over to Erica, who's gonna help us understand a little bit of how we got here to this moment in capitalism.
Thank you so much, Salifu. That was wonderful. Just to confirm, who's advancing the slides? Not me, correct?
It's Shaquille.
Okay, great. All right, so yeah, I'm gonna give you a brief history of slavery and a little bit on the history of South Carolina, and then Josh will tie it all together in after me. Next slide. To get it started, I wanna start off with a little discussion question. That question is, what role did slavery play in the development of capitalism? And I'll give y'all some time to drop some responses in the chat. Free labor made it easy for future exploitation. Enslaved Africans were capital. Black folks built this world for free. We built their capital. We were their capital. Exploited free labor. Used racism as a means to reinforce capitalism. Cotton fueled the Industrial Revolution. Free labor equals more profits than other capitalists, outcompeting others and creating hegemonic monopolies. To pit enslaved Africans against poor white Europeans to sow the seeds of competition. Great responses. It simultaneously mainstreamed anti-Blackness while globalizing capitalism. Good stuff. All right, next slide. So I'm gonna start off the conversation by talking a little bit about primitive accumulation. So essentially primitive accumulation is the period before capitalism develops, when the ruling class or those in power use violence, land theft, enslavement, exploitation of indigenous lands and resources, etc., to establish themselves and eventually a capitalist system. And this phase typically occurs before the development of capitalism. Next slide. So here's a timeline, a little bit of history of slavery and its development in the West. So essentially during this period of primitive accumulation in the West and where we are today, the Europeans devastated indigenous American communities throughout the Americas. They took over trade routes, they took over food supplies, they forcibly enslaved indigenous men, women, and children, and most significantly, they introduced diseases to indigenous populations that they had no resistances to. So you have places like the Caribbean, where indigenous communities were completely wiped out by these combined effects of European colonialism. And then places like the South Carolina Lowcountry, where I am today, on Kiowa and Siwi land, about 90% of the indigenous communities were killed off essentially during this period of primitive accumulation. And because of this, it made it very easy for Europeans to occupy their lands with little resistance once these effects kind of took place. And during this early period of primitive accumulation, Europeans began relying heavily on the labor of enslaved Africans. You can go back to the last slide for a second. So in 1444, you see the Portuguese launching the slave trade. They have been circumventing Africa, trading with different African kingdoms, and eventually they set up a slave trading post on these islands right off the coast of West Africa, and then they started shipping enslaved people to Europe. In 1492, of course, Christopher Columbus lands on what is today Dominican Republic and Haiti, and he starts enslaving indigenous people there. Fast forward about 50 years, France starts occupying indigenous lands near what is today Quebec in Canada. And then the English were pretty late to the game. By the 1560s, they got involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Next slide. So this is just a map essentially of the different indigenous American lands and the different European powers that claimed them during this period of early colonialism and primitive accumulation. So by the time the British developed a stronghold in North America, the transatlantic slave trade had already been firmly rooted in this part of the world. And every economy in Europe depended on slavery in some way. And as time progresses, what you see is a shift from primitive accumulation to what is called mercantilism or monopoly capitalism or merchant capitalism. So essentially, merchant capitalism is a form of early capitalism that involved monopolizing certain industries like sugar, coffee, and rice through the use of exclusively slave labor. So monopoly is a way of dominating or having exclusive control over an industry. And merchant capitalism fueled Europe's economy in the 15, 16, and 1700s. And sometimes you'll see primitive accumulation and merchant capitalism existing at the same time. Like we look at the timeline, different European powers were taking over and occupying indigenous lands at different times. And so sometimes you see these things happening simultaneously. So if you look at the map and the bluish green portions, those are the English territories. So you have, zoom if you will, kind of take a closer look at the Southeast Atlantic coast. That's what we're going to talk a little bit more about in this next slide. So by 1670, 200 plus years after the slave trade has been going on, Charlestown, present-day Charleston, South Carolina, is founded. So Charleston went through its own period of primitive accumulation as the indigenous communities of South Carolina's Lowcountry, like I said, the Kiowa, the Siwi people, they were enslaved, they were displaced, they were wiped out from the combined effects of Europeans coming and occupying their lands. Next slide. And so this is the artist's rendition of what the Kiowa people here in present day Charleston looked like before they were pretty much annihilated by Europeans, by the English and the French. They were thriving in this area. So over time, Charleston quickly became the slavery capital of North America. In the early period of the development of Charleston, enslaved Africans were responsible for clearing land, cutting down trees. A lot of the lumber that they produced was used in the shipbuilding industry. And when they cleared that land early on in that early period, they would then graze a lot of animals. So you have some of the first Black cowboys here in Charleston, and they were a lot of times sending that beef and that pork down to sister colonies in the Caribbean, like Barbados, which was the sister colony of Charleston. A lot of the enslaved people in the early period that were brought to Charleston came from Barbados, Angola, and Congo. Next slide. So eventually rice was introduced in South Carolina Lowcountry in like the late 1690s. And within about a 50-year period, rice became the #1 cash crop in colonial America and in colonial Charleston. And the economy shifted from a period of primitive accumulation where there was a lot of land clearing going on, like I said, animal husbandry, to this merchant capitalism where rice is the dominant industry in the Lowcountry. And the success of the rice industry in Charleston led to the mass importation of enslaved Africans into Charleston. And from that point on, the South Carolina Lowcountry has a Black majority for the majority of its history. And Africans here were not enslaved simply for their labor, but for their expertise in a variety of industries. And rice being one of them. Rice was grown in West Africa for millennia before it was introduced to the Lowcountry. They also grew cash crops like indigo. They have indigo has a long, rich history in Africa as well. And Europeans exploited all of this. And they were engaged, like I said, in a variety of other industries. And back just to take it back a little bit, Charleston because it had this Black majority, Europeans had to figure out a way to control the populations here. And they had this existing relationship with Barbados that had been a sugar colony for a while before Charleston even came about. And so they the English in Charleston adopted slave codes from Barbados so that they could control their interests to ensure that they continued to profit off of slave labor at the expense of the African majority that they were controlling. I'm gonna take it back to the last slide for a second. So nearly half of all enslaved people were brought through the ports of North America via Charleston. There's a small island right in the Charleston harbor called Sullivan's Island, and that's where all the slave ships were made to stop before they brought enslaved people. They had to quarantine there before they could bring enslaved people to the mainland. And by the time rice was firmly rooted as the #1 industry here, they were bringing these people from the rice coast of West Africa, whereas earlier in the history, they were bringing them from Angola, Congo, and parts of the Caribbean. Now they're bringing them almost exclusively from this area around the Sierra Leone River. So the British had this slave trading hub at Bunce Island, which is this island in the mouth of the Sierra Leone River. And there was basically a pipeline between Bunce Island and Sullivan's Island, right outside of in the Charleston Harbor. And because we had so many people being brought from the same region of Africa straight to Charleston by the tens of thousands each year, we have this development of this unique culture here in the Lowcountry called Gullah Geechee, which as it expanded westward, it is contributed a lot to the culture of African Americans overall. Next slide. So throughout the 1700s, enslaved Africans were forced to convert thousands upon thousands of acres of coastal swampland, essentially all along the Southeast, into the rice field complexes that enriched Charleston. So this map kind of demonstrates historically where those areas were. So you see the southern coast of North Carolina, all the way through South Carolina and Georgia's coast to the top of Florida's coast. These were where rice was historically grown. And these rice fields are still visible all over the South Carolina Lowcountry today. And this next slide is just some images of Black folks who were engaged in rice farming in the Lowcountry. It's really deadly, labor intensive, back-breaking labor. Diseases were prevalent, mosquito-borne diseases. You see, you have to kind of be standing in water in order to grow rice in the Lowcountry. So the mortality rates were extremely high, especially for infants and the elderly. which is why Europeans brought so many Africans here each year to kind of replace those who were dying off due to the working conditions in these rice plantations in the Lowcountry. Next slide. So by the 1800s, there's a shift from this monopoly merchant capitalism to industrial capitalism. And that kind of grew out of the outgrowth of cotton, the cotton industry, and expansion of cotton. So that all helped spur the development of the industrial capitalism. So the system of capitalism is developing. And this big picture here is it's just an image of Ashley River and this highly developed area of Ashley River, which is in Charleston, in the Charleston area. And if you look where the arrow is pointing, you kind of see these grid patterns in the marsh along the banks of the river, and that's kind of a remnant of a rice field. So if you look at Google Earth and just pick any river along South Carolina's coast, especially Edisto, Ashley, Cooper River, you'll see these remnants of this rice fields. Again, this was like an ancient technology that Africans were using to create these. And so that's why they're a lot of times still intact to this day. But over time, the rice industry began to decline. So South Carolina planters, capitalists, they were no longer able to monopolize the trade in rice as other markets began to open up, like the Asian markets and even markets in Louisiana and Texas and the Gulf Coast, where their land could tolerate heavy machinery that our swampy, marshy lands here in South Carolina couldn't tolerate. So with that, you also have the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. Next slide. So there's basically a surplus of enslaved Africans that are held in bondage here in the Southeast Atlantic coast. And slave owners basically took advantage of the expansion of the short staple cotton industry to recoup their losses. And what they did was they sold African men, women, and children westward. And as the cotton industry expanded, we sold a lot of our cotton to the northern states, but we also sold a lot of it to the UK, to Britain. And the British purchases of cotton stimulated the expansion of the Cotton Kingdom. And private and state-owned banks in the South were getting loans from England to buy seeds, to purchase enslaved workers, to purchase land. They were being extended this credit to basically create the Cotton Kingdom. And the cotton grown in the Deep South was exported to these mills in England, and they were turning the raw materials basically into fabrics. So just to give you an idea, in the 1780s, while rice was still peaking in terms of its as a cash crop in the Lowcountry, about 11 million pounds of cotton were sold to England. 50 years later, by the 1830s, almost 300 million pounds of cotton were sold to England. So it grew, the industry grew exponentially. Next slide. And this is just a map of the Deep South, the Black Belts, on the eve of the Civil War. So again, if you look at the coastal region, historically, in the 100 years before this map was created, most of the enslaved Africans were concentrated in the coast, in the Lowcountry, where in the rice field kind of complex. But as cotton boomed, they started to be sold westward as far as East Texas. Next slide, yeah, perfect. In the South Carolina Lowcountry, in addition to, let me back up. So in 1861, no, you can go back to the next slide, sorry. Thank you. So in 1861, the South went to war with the North over their right to enslave people in order to protect their interests, because again, cotton was just booming, and the wealth that they were amassing as a result of being able to not have to pay their workers, they were willing to die for the right to continue to do that. And although they lost the Civil War, they managed to keep in place the same system, so that conditions for Black folks in the Deep South didn't really change in the years that followed. So in the 100 years or so after the Civil War, although chattel slavery was abolished on paper, except for those who committed a crime, sharecropping, which was just slavery under another name, dominated the Deep South for the next 100 years. So Black hands built every aspect of Charleston, right? It was only able to become the richest city in colonial America because of the free labor of enslaved Africans, right? And Charleston's economy today continues to benefit off of the wealth generated by enslaved people. It's the #1 tourism industry and has been for the last decade. And when tourists come to Charleston, like this image here is the shopping district downtown, they want to see the architecture, they want to eat the food, they want to hear the language, all of that Black, all of that rooted in Africa. And just like was the case with our enslaved African ancestors, Black folks today who continue to run the city still have no access to the multi-billion-dollar tourism industry that Charleston is thriving off of today. And in 2017, the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture published the report on racial disparities in Charleston County. And it basically, this report highlights the gaping inequalities in income, education, health, wellness, policing, housing, and overall quality of life in Charleston's Black communities. And it ties them all back to the history of slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and the overall just neglect on the parts of the local government of the Black community. So just to wrap up my discussion, my segment, I want to just ask one more question, and that is, what are some of the inequalities that Black people in your communities deal with?
And I also realize that y'all have the ability to raise your hand. So if you want to answer this out loud, you can raise your hand and I'll let you speak.
And I'll repeat the question one more time, if that helps. What are some of the inequalities that Black people in your communities deal with? Lack of access to healthy food. Ooh, they coming in fast. Access to housing, food, education, gentrification, police brutality, access to nutritional food, food deserts, gentrification, housing inequality, gentrification, housing discrimination, police brutality, low wages, over policing, lack of access to public transit, lack of access to quality housing, food deserts, criminalization of our youth, lack of quality education, school to prison pipeline, food deserts, COVID, prison industrial complex. Thank you for all of your responses and for giving me your attention. I'm going to pass it over to Josh, and he's going to tie it all together.
Peace. Thank you, Erica, for that great presentation. So Salifu talked about, the basics of capitalism, and Erica talked about the role of slavery in the development of capitalism. So I'm about to talk about, what the state's role is in all of this. So what is the state? Next slide, please. All right, so according to Lenin, the state is a special organization of force. It is an organization of violence for the suppression of some class. So Erica talked about, the development of slavery. And I think, we have to think about what allowed for slavery to happen, what allowed for this type of conquest, exploitation, and enslavement that happened on such a mass scale. And I think, this definition really gives us a working understanding of what allowed that to happen. And it was a special armed force or a special organization of men who had weapons and who had the backing of an entire nations, AKA it was a state. It was a state that allowed for this to happen. Next slide, please. All right, so why does the state come into society in general? Why does it come about? So according to Lenin, the state is a product and manifestation of the irreconcilability of class contradictions. The state arises where, when, and to the extent that class contradictions cannot be reconciled. And conversely, the existence of the state proves that class contradictions are irreconcilable. So what does this mean? What does this mean for us? It means that whenever there are haves and have-nots, there has to be some organization, some instrument, some tool that mitigates these issues, like Salifu talked about earlier. You know, you're on an island and you have water, you have trees, you have fruit growing from the trees, you have livestock, etc. And, you know, we can either divide all this up amongst each other, or we can do what Salifu talked about. 10 people make hammers, and they start guarding all the resources. If you want some chickens, you got to go through the person with the hammers. If you want some water, you got to go through the person with the hammers. In essence, Salifu was really describing like the rise of the state, you know, and these tools that allow for a certain group of people to control the means of production, AKA the resources, AKA the land, AKA the things that we need to survive as a whole in society. Next slide, please. All right. So, in other words, you know, the capitalism, there's a struggle between classes. So Salifu alluded to earlier, you have the proletariat or the working class people, us, the masses of people, and then you have the capitalist class of people and the bourgeois. And in this struggle between these two classes, you know, the state is really not a neutral entity. So the ruling class or the people in power usually have control of the state. So that's why you have in the United States, you know, we have the police, we have the military, we have the National Guard, and essentially we don't control these institutions and organizations. It's the people in power. And to give a concrete example of what the opposite looks like, you know, when socialism occurs and the people have control of the state, you have things that happen like the Cuban Revolution. And when people rise up and seize power of their state from the colonial power, from the capitalist power, and then they use the state to redistribute land, food, wealth, water, etc. Next slide, please. And these are just examples, just illustrating what capitalists do. All right, next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about the functions of the state. So now that we've learned what it consists of. All right, next slide. So the state, as I said before, is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is a creation of quote unquote order, which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflicts between classes. Again, the state not only has these tools, has these weapons, but it also has the power of the law. It can make things legal, it can make things illegal, it can make violence legal, depending on who commits it. It can make theft legal, depending on who commits it. Next slide, please. And just to go back to what Eric was talking about during the slavery era, you know, we had to ask, you know, what were Africans doing during this time, and how was the state used against Africans? So during the slavery era, the state was used to subjugate Africans so that they could be exploited for profit of the ruling class, the white slave owning elite. You know, during this era is when police forces really came to be, because if you think about it, if you really think about it, and you really study the history of enslavement in the South and the United States in general, but particularly in the South, most of these enslavers were outnumbered by the Africans on the plantations and generally in the area, by the Africans as well as other Native Americans and indigenous peoples. So in order for you to exploit a larger group of people, you need some organization that can use force, that can coerce people to do things, that can make laws, that can take things from people, that can give things to people. You know, you need a state for this to happen. And we see this particularly in Charleston with in the Lowcountry area, because there was such a large amount of Africans that outnumbered the white people, that they had to develop these special police forces, AKA the slave patrols, AKA the paddy rollers, who hunted down, you know, freedom-seeking Africans, African revolutionaries, in addition to using the military and militias to put down revolts. All right, so 1 second. right, so let me check the chat. What are we talking about in the chat? All right, next slide, please. All right, so again, these are just some examples of the state putting down revolts and the state monitoring and surveilling and coercing Africans. So again, we had Nat Turner's rebellion, and that was put down by militia backed by the state. You have slave patrols and militias as well that are fueled by the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, so that they, in places like South Carolina, and particularly in the Charleston area, after the Stoner Rebellion, which we're going to get to in a second, all white men were legally obligated to carry firearms, especially on Sunday during church. It became law. So the Second Amendment was even weaponized against enslaved people, and the state is the culprit because the state made it legal, and the state was the one who gave these people the power to do so. So next slide, please. And again, here, we're talking about history. So in 1526, at the mouth of the Savannah River, which is basically on the border between South Carolina and Georgia, about 100 enslaved Africans were brought here by Spaniards coming from Hispaniola at the time, San Domingo or Haiti. And these Africans essentially revolted against the Spaniards. And now this is a special case, a very lesser known instance of rebellion, but this is unique because the Africans, they partnered up with the Native Americans and they kicked the Spaniards out. And they could do this because the Spaniards had not developed a strong state yet. So they were able to have a battle, have a rebellion, have a revolt. And as Malcolm X said, it was even Steven. So they got them boys up out of there. And they had to go back to Hispaniola, where they were camped out. Next slide, please. Here we have an example of the Stoner Rebellion, which happened in 1739. Again, in the Charleston area in the Lowcountry, there were a lot of revolts and rebellions that happened in this area because there were so many enslaved people who were trying to get their freedom. And, this is an example of the state. Even though this is one of the most quote unquote successful rebellions, they killed about 40 or 50 white people. They were marching south toward Florida, Fort Mose, because at the time, Florida was kind of a refuge for enslaved Africans seeking freedom at the time. And they weren't able to make it there because the state put them down. So the state ended that revolt. Next slide, please. 1822, we have Denmark Vesey, who attempted to plan one of the largest slave revolts. His idea was to rally all of the enslaved Africans to kill their masters and to all come to Charleston and to get on boats and head to Haiti. That was his plan. But unfortunately, one of our own snitched on him and they put the revolt down. They arrested Denmark Vesey and about 30 plus people were executed. Again, this is an example of the state putting down a slave revolt, people trying to get free. Next slide. And we have also one of the, most misunderstood, I guess you could say, conflicts in history, which was the Seminole Wars, AKA the Gullah Wars, where this went on for almost 30 years, where Africans, again, like the Stoner rebels, were trying to make their way to Florida. A large number of them did make their way to Florida, and they partnered up they allied with other indigenous people who were in Florida as well. And they formed these semi-autonomous free communities within Florida. And of course, your boy Andrew Jackson was not messing with that. So Andrew Jackson and the state engaged in some of the most brutal warfare against these people who are simply trying to live and be free. And I know we all learned about the Trail of Tears in high school or middle school, whenever we learned about it. Again, direct result of the state intervening and putting down revolts and rebellions. Next slide, please. Again, these are just examples of the Seminole Wars. All right, now bringing it a little bit up to speed. Even during Jim Crow segregation era, the state was used by the ruling class to enforce racist apartheid laws. Now, if we think about it, we all went to, when we went to school and high school, we see all these pictures of, the civil rights movement. We see people getting hosed down with water hoses, people getting bit by dogs, etc. People marching in the streets. And we got to ask ourselves, who are these people marching against? Every time we see all these Black people in the street, who are they marching against? Who is there in their opposition? Who are they trying to get free from? Time and time again, we see images like this. It's the state. Next slide, please. The police departments. The police. And, can you go back? And this isn't just like some relic of history. Even today, in our lifetimes, we saw some of the largest uprisings in history. And again, it's the same picture. Who are we, trying to get free from? Who is opposing us whenever we're trying to get free? It's the police departments. A lot more militarized now, you can see. It's the police departments. The people instinctively know who their enemies are. You see people burning down the Minneapolis Police Department. That wasn't by coincidence. Ferguson. It's the state. Next slide, please. So what does the state consist of? It doesn't only consist of, the military and the police departments. Next slide. The state also consists, so the state does not merely consist of armed men, but also of material adjuncts, prisons, and institutions of coercion of all kinds, of which Klan society knew nothing. So in other words, prison industrial complex, mass incarceration. The state needs these large reserves of labor, hyper-exploited labor in order to function. So that's why we have things like mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex. It's a permanent fixture of capitalist society. And again, we see, this is Angola prison in Louisiana, one of the most notorious prisons for the conditions of basically one big plantation. Angola, again, Rikers Island. These are the conditions that people live through in capitalism. All right, now, so we talked about, the state, and we talked about capitalism, and we talked about slavery. So we also have to understand, what national oppression is when it comes to all of this. So what is national oppression? First of all, what is a nation? Before we get to what national oppression is, we have to understand what a nation is. So next slide. So basically, a nation is a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language inhabiting a particular country or territory. So, could you go to the next slide? If we basically stripped all of the county and state lines away and all those other arbitrary dividers, and we just really focused on, what's illustrated in this map, where people are distributed at, Black people in particular, we can see that Black people in the South, there's a crescent-shaped territory where Black people are the majority or near majority. And if we see this, we see that there's we in this area, we share common history, common economic condition, common language, common culture. It's a nation, it's essentially a nation. So in 2010, about 55% of the Black population lived in the South, and of 105 Southern counties, had 50% or higher in their Black population. So in a total of 308 million people in the United States, about 40 million or 13% identify as Black alone. Now, just to put that in perspective, that is larger. If we had a nation, that would be larger than all of Scandinavia combined, Belgium, Bulgaria, Greece, Hungary, Netherlands, Romania, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So why don't we have a nation? Next slide. And if you put a population map next to what is like a map that details the incarceration rates of states, you can see that the Black Belt South is the most incarcerated states, or the most incarcerated region. And it lines up almost identically with the population distribution of Black people in what is a Black nation. So you know, this is when we talk about, I think we get into it on the next slide, but national oppression. So what is national oppression? One of the main forms of special oppression under capitalism is national oppression, or the exploitation of a whole people based on their nationality. In order for us to understand this, then we have to recognize that what a nation is, that a nation does exist in the South, and that since a nation exists, there is a special form of repression and oppression that the capitalist state has to enact on this certain population of people existing in this certain territory. Next slide, please. Right, so we've come to the conclusion, hopefully we've come to the conclusion that Africans in the United States do constitute a nation, that all nations should be free, and that we must free the land. And next slide, I think that's, all right, so now we can kind of talk about, we're gonna back it up.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in the chat.
Oh yeah, the chat, we're going off in the chat right now. Exactly. Yeah, so I hope y'all enjoyed, this presentation, and I really am enjoying some of the comments in the chat. Don't forget about the 1811 slave revolt in Southern, exactly.
Somebody asked why the American Civil War was fought.
Why was the Civil War fought? Well, the Civil War was fought because it really depends on your interpretation. The Civil War was essentially fought. I personally think the Civil War started before the Civil War even started. Put it that way. You have all these instances of Africans who are resisting on all different fronts. And you have white people who are trying to figure out, what are we going to do with these Africans? We're importing too many Africans. We can't control them all. How do we control them? We have Northerners, even Southerners, who I was reading a book about slave rebellions, talking about the sheer anxiety that white people had living in the South. Like, they couldn't even go to sleep because they were so scared of the uprisings. They were so scared of the enslaved population slitting their throats at night. Like, it was that real. So you have the industrialists who are still benefiting from slavery, because the North, they want to make it seem like the North and the South were so separate when they're part of the same economy. So you have the industrialists in the North who are trying to develop industrially, and you have the Southerners in the South who want to keep slavery, who want to keep exploiting their enslaved populations. And then you have all these different enslaved peoples who are resisting and who are starting to, really become awakened to their conditions. So essentially, I think, damn. So essentially, the Civil War was fought between, that's a big question.
Erica, you want to tap in?
My interpretation is that it was fought over the state right to enslave one group of people by another.
Right. So I mean, the Civil War was like, it was a thing. It was a natural evolution of what was going to happen, if the state didn't intervene, because they saw what was happening in Haiti, they saw what was happening in Cuba. So they figured that, the South, the North was trying to figure out a way to contain slavery, and the South was trying to expand slavery, and it came to a head. So they fought.
David asked, sorry, it wasn't, I'm sorry, I added Lewis, but I meant to add David. David asked, I have a question about class consciousness. My peers are typically privileged and work in engineering jobs, and because we're relatively well compensated among the working class, most don't care about understanding the system we live under. What would you guys suggest as a way to get people to start caring, or at least be curious? So David, I think your question is a good question, right? Because sometimes when we talk about when we talk about class dynamics in the United States, we have a tendency to go, there's the working class and the proletariat, and then there's the bourgeoisie. But within the working class in itself, Like working class literally only means that you sell your labor to somebody else. Within that, there's like wide gaps and varieties of sort of like, I guess, flavors that comes in. And I think that comes back to something that Lenin theorized as well, with the concept of the labor aristocracy, like where within the working class, you have this sort of section of workers whose work is valued, I guess the most simple way to put it, is valued more than others, or is privileged more than others, because it has like a level of prestige to it, right? But the thing that I would tell to people who this, I guess we call them like middle class people, is that or I like the word petty bourgeoisie, aspirational bourgeoisie, that they could historically have taken, you're right, like middle class ain't a class, right? But historically they've taken one or two routes. You either have this level of participation in the aristocracy, and you like recognize it, and you like you use it to sort of jump out of the position, so like you use it to align yourself with people on the bottom, or you just become a class traitor. In 2022, I don't think that there's a lot of use in being a class trader, because even when we talk about people like engineers, doctors, lawyers, like these people who kind of make up this class where like you're well off. Think about what that means in 2022 in the United States, especially if you're a colonized person, you're African, you're Chicano, or so on and so forth. What that really means is that you have lots of access to credit, but you don't yeah, y'all getting money, but like y'all not getting money like that. It's not forever, it's not permanent. Most people are like natural disaster or a serious family health emergency away from never seeing that status again. Like you just got there and it can be easily taken away from you. That's something that I would say to people in those positions. And I think that they are worth trying to organize and trying to agitate around. Like I would invite them to stuff like this. We have a list of resources that we're going to share with you guys at the end. I would share that list of resources with them as well. But ultimately, when it comes to people like that, I would say it's worth trying, but they are going to have to make the decision ultimately on how they're going to move in the society and how they're going to move toward how they want to exist to as we are building in this situation where we're building toward revolution, because revolution is inevitable whether they want to participate in it or not. So either they get on board or they get ate too. Somebody, Xavier, do you want to speak to ask this question, or do you just want to ask it in the chat? You said I want to ask about personal class antagonism in schools and how we investigate that system, especially in high school. If you want to do you want to raise your hand to speak about that? All right. You should be able to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my specific question was how do we interrogate personal class antagonism in high school? Because personally, I am in high school, I'm a freshman, and I feel like since a lot of people feel like I am a quote unquote smart kid and I know what I'm talking about, they personally have they have the quote unquote smart kids up against the teachers who are the upper class in the school, and have the quote unquote smart students betray their other peers. And like I'm not sure how to explain, but how do we investigate on like how can we investigate that? How can we like not come to that solution? Like how I'm so sorry. It's not a very structured question. I just wanted to know.
Talk through it.
I'm trying. I'm sorry. How do we interrogate how like a lot of quote unquote smart students are betraying their other peers and going with teachers from the validation that they get from them? because I feel like it aligns with like the classes of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie class of some workers, they get some sort of validation. They get a little bit of money from the bourgeoisie class and think they all that. They think they, some shit. But but then they get betrayed by the bourgeoisie class, obviously, because of like other reasons why. And it happens a lot in school of where they get betrayed by the teachers in some sort of way. And the quote unquote smart students is like, oh, well, damn. And now we don't trust them either. So how do we solve that issue?
So basically, you're saying like, how do you not feed into that that artificial divide?
Yes. How do I not feed into that?
When they have like, oh, the smart, they try to single out the smart kids and like try to make, oh, we got the smart kids over here and we got the rest of them over there, type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think as a student, you just gotta, I think you have to just try to make relationships with those kids who may feel, that feel alienated because they may not be as, what is seen as smart according to the teacher. So like building those personal relationships. I don't know if y'all have any student organizations on campus, but
I'm actually I'm actually building one.
Yeah, so you're doing the right thing.
That later, but I didn't want to take up too much time.
Now you're doing the right thing. So yeah, definitely like build those student organizations and invite those kids in who may not be that good at math or may not, struggle in writing or whatever, and then you can use that to build those relationships and bridge those gaps, with those student organizations.
Problem of like,
No, go ahead.
I feel like that's also a problem of them demonizing Black children who smoke weed and they drink alcohol and they sort of they demonize the fuck out of them, calling them like bad students. I'm literally in this program of tag of talent and gifted testing where they put me in advanced classes and they allow me to speak at board meetings and school board meetings because they think I'm smart and I have good grades. It's very harmful. Also, wait, somebody else said something in the chat that was really good of like the gifted programs, those two. But yeah, I feel like that gives the quote unquote smart students a platform for them to betray their fellow students. Right. Yeah, making me as a poster child. They literally do that.
Right. Yeah, you just gotta actively build those relationships with those students, and just don't feed into it, using those student organizations, like you said, to build those relationships and give space to those students who may not feel they can go to the teacher for help with something. They may not even need help. They might just not feel comfortable, with the teacher. So I think it's a lot of different things that you could do if you really use your organization and build your organization and bring those students together and provide the space for them to maybe air out some of their grievances to the teacher or the school systems or whatever. And you might get to the bottom of a lot of the stuff that you're trying to get to the bottom of, which I think you have to have that space for them to feel comfortable and to commune with you in order to do that.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I didn't want to make up too much space and have room for other people to ask questions, but yeah, I'm sorry.
You're fine.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for coming through and asking that question. And we love that you organizing, and we hope to hear some updates about that. You got the.
Of course. I actually have my other comrade in here. She's actually 14. I think she's 15. Yeah. But thank you so much.
Yeah, power to y'all. Power to y'all. So I want to be conscious of time because it is 8:19, but I do there's so much questions and so much engagement happening in the chat. So if there are other people that want to ask questions or want to add comments, say so in the chat, raise your hand. Let us bring you on the stage. We want to hear what y'all got to say.
Well, Kenneth says, did Reconstruction after the Civil War fail? No, it did not fail. It was defeated by white supremacists using violence to suppress Black people. I think Reconstruction is one of the most, I think we got to study Reconstruction to really learn a lot about what Black people were doing at that time, how they were organizing themselves, because a lot of the, even the public school system, that we have today came out of Reconstruction era policy where Black people felt that all people needed to be educated, period. It should be a public good. So I think, you know, at least the way we were taught about Reconstruction in high school is that it was just a failure, and that, you know, Black people were too incompetent to govern themselves. And they like to use that as an example. But in reality, Reconstruction was an opportunity, I think, to for Black people really to envision what the type of society that they wanted to live in, really for the first time since they were, you know, brought to this continent. So I don't think it was a failure. I think that it was an orchestrated. It was a defeat. What the state used, actually, the state was used to defeat Reconstruction, because they pulled the federal troops out. So there was no more support in the South after the Civil War, when, you know, the rise of white terrorism was happening. So they kind of did the inverse. They pulled the state out and they pulled the federal troops out, so that we had no, you know, protection. They started to, I know in South Carolina, for example, in Charleston area, there was a lot of Black troops and Black soldiers who fought in the Union Army to liberate themselves. And after the Civil War, they would go back to, you know, their communities, the Sea Island communities, the Lowcountry areas, and they still had militias. There were still Black militias going on. So they were defending themselves, they were defending their land. But then, you know, once Jim Crow started to arise, they started to kind of figure out, the state started to figure out ways of how to get the guns out of these Black people's hands, you know, how to end these gun clubs and these militias that Black people had. And when that happened, it was, you know, Black people were vulnerable and they were exposed. So then you have, you know, they're exposed to the lynchings, and they're exposed to all of the different legal procedures that they use in order to really prop up Jim Crow segregation and take away Black people's rights. So no, I think Reconstruction was defeated intentionally by white America.
Thank you, Josh. We also got Jordan on stack. Jordan, welcome to the stage. What's up?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jordan. It's interesting because I'm actually a student teacher, so I'm learning to become a teacher. So it's interesting to hear Xavier, because I'm asking the flip. Basically, I can see this division happen, and it's really BS. Like the way that these teachers talk about these students, as if, and I work in a district that's a huge demographic of immigrants. I mean, I want to say the district that I work in has one of the highest percentages of immigrants in all of the US. So it's a huge immigrant population with a lot of Black and brown students. And so I see how a lot of these teachers talk about them and treat them. And I basically I know I'm working within this framework, but ways that I can basically be subversive. Yeah, I don't have a necessarily structured question either, but just ways that I can maybe incorporate more, just being better, not being so divisive, like ways I can maybe support and empower my students using more radical politics.
All right, that's a question that I want people to weigh in on. Can you ask the question one more time so people can respond to you in the chat?
Yeah, basically just different ways as the teacher, right? Because as Xavier, the question that Xavier posed, ways that I can prevent, and not just even prevent, but go on the offense, I guess, to help empower them and maybe open their eyes to this, in developing their own class consciousness and stuff like that. So just not being divisive, and how I can better support them because they're the oppressed, literally.
Yeah. All right, y'all. So flood the chat with responses to that question from Jordan. I'm only doing that because I want to we had another question from Darius. Darius, I'm gonna bring you in so that you can ask your question, and we can have a bunch of responses and things happening to the questions at the same time, if that's cool. So we'll get Darius up in here. All right, Darius, welcome to the stage.
Hey, y'all, can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, so I guess my question, I said, how are capitalism and feudalism different, and how did capitalism evolve from feudalism? Because I'm only understanding that, like, we talk about how capitalism formed and like these different like precursors to capitalism, but we don't really talk about like this is not like some kind of random event. Like it had to have happened because of something. Like, I don't know, like these different nations of people have existed before like this concept occurred, right? Like these people were untouched. These were like untouched histories. And so something had to have happened for like this to become like some kind of phenomenon. I just wanted to know like what was it, feudalism, or like where does the disconnect happen between before and then capitalism? I hope that makes sense.
So you asking what's the difference between feudalism and capitalism, like that development?
I guess that doesn't matter, but that first question was me like buffering what my actual question was. My real question is like how, because I think that was mentioned before, that like before it was feudalism, then it became capitalism. Like why did that come about?
Oh, so feudalism basically was, I think one of the main distinctions for me is that at least in Europe, feudalism was where peasants were kind of tied to the land and they were expected to work the land that they did not own. And that the land was usually owned by kings or queens or monarchs or noblemen. And you couldn't necessarily like buy land. Land was kind of something that was willed in, or it was kind of something that everyone didn't have access to. So when capitalism came about, the free market came about. So technically anybody could buy land, anybody could accumulate capital, and anybody could, essentially move up in their class. That's why so many people came to the United States, because it was a capitalist society. They were no longer stuck in these, the social statuses that they were stuck in Europe, which was basically predicated on your birth, what class you were born into. And when capitalism came about, it really didn't matter what class you were born into. If you could steal some land, you could steal some land. And if you could steal some Africans from the continent, you could steal some Africans. And if you could set up a plantation, then you could set up a plantation. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think really like a distinction is that, feudalism, people were tied to the land, peasants were tied to the land, and they really had no type of mobility. But in capitalism, it really didn't matter. It was kind of a free for all in theory. That's why so many people came to exploit to exploit the land and the people and the resources.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. Sorry. So the last things that we have 3 questions that we want y'all to respond to. So the 3 questions are like, what's a new thing that you learned today? What's a thing that you're seeing differently? And like, generally, what did you think about the session? And like, we need feedback on how to make it better. So you can answer 1 of them questions, you can answer 2 of them questions, you can answer 3 of them questions, but we just want responses to the questions, please. So you can type them in the chat, and if you want to come on stage and say anything, you can raise your hand and we can do that. We'll do it that way too. David has written labor aristocracy as a concept. Darius says something new. I'm a part of a nation of Africans. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. And you are an African, period. Regardless of where you are, you just an African on a different landmass having the experience that the Africans there are having. All right, Darius. Wait, Darius, are you still here?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
I'm
Oh, that wasn't a new hand raise, it was an old one. Okay, I'm gonna send you back to the lounge. All right, so let's see what we got. African, displaced, dislocated. Exactly, y'all. Nation-minded Africans in here. I love it. How Kenneth Morgan said, how young people think. Very serious. Yes, I'm very impressed by Xavier. Kim Clark says, seeing things differently. I'm not alone in seeing people around me are bougie. Listen, Africans in the US swear that they bougie, right? It is very interesting. I mean, I'm sure it's like that in the Caribbean and in other places. There's an African petty bourgeoisie on the African continent too, but yeah, it is hilarious to observe. Erica said, I think this was so great, honestly, from the video on capitalism to the in-depth history on South Carolina and slavery to the description of the state. Yes, Tanky's got to always get that definition of the state in. So thank you. Michael said, appreciate the suggestion on reads. I'm a peep The Negro National Colonial Question by Nelson Peary based on Lewis's recommendation. Lewis, thank you for so much for being in the chat, throwing out Rex. Also, before y'all go, I'm going to drop this link in the chat for you, and we'll also send it in a follow-up email. But this is a list of resources for people who want to continue to learn and push this education on capitalism. And Shaquille, will you take me to the, was there a final slide? If not, anyway, it's fine. We have our next session coming up in 2 weeks, and it's gonna be about imperialism. Yes, on March 14th. What is imperialism? Yeah, you can rewatch on Facebook. Find us on Facebook, Lowcountry Action Committee, you can rewatch it. So March 14, what is imperialism? That's gonna be hosted by Black Alliance for Peace South. Y'all, you have to learn what imperialism is. You have to come to that session because people be using the word imperialism and it's not the word that they want to use. We have to understand imperialism in this time because imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. So everything that you learn today is going to be expanded on in the next session. So come back, bring a friend. We're going to really talk about what imperialism is. So anybody else want to add?
Thanks for your time, y'all.
Some of what is capitalism next time. Okay, we'll do that in the email as well, Kenneth. Thank you for that suggestion. All right. Thanks so much, y'all.
Peace.